Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, and I'm up to shenanigans, as always, of cosmic proportions. This week, I'm really excited to be talking about a new adaptation of Lovecraft's work called The Color Out of Space. All right, I couldn't wait for this to be out. I've been hearing about this movie for months. It's finally out. It just came out, I think, this month, so 2020. It's directed by Richard Stanley. It stars Nicolas Cage as Nate, which I think is kind of a nice update. They call him Nathan. The character he plays would be Naam from the original story. Jolie Richardson is fantastic. She's Teresa, his wife. Madeline Arthur is Lavinia, his daughter. Now, this is not to be confused with Lavinia from the Dunwich Horror. She just happens to be a female character that replaces one of the sons from the original short story. Elliot Knight is Ward. We're going to come back to who he is. He's basically he's the narrator of, in the short story. He's, the land surveyor. He's a hydrologist, I believe. And, he is essentially the lens through which the story is told. Julian Hilliard is Jack. He's the youngest son. If you remember the short story, they had sort of these really antiquated biblical names, the children, so they gave them more modern names. Brendan Meyer, I think it's Meyer, is Benny. He's probably the middle son. And then Corianna Kilcher is the mayor, who has a brief role in the movie. Now, what is fantastic about this is that Stanley makes a real effort to find the true horror that is inherent in Color Out of Space. Color Out of Space was, if I recall, one of Lovecraft's favorite short stories of anything he'd ever written. And it is the one I feel that he put the most effort into, genuinely making scary, and not because of any of his hang-ups. You know, there is a fear of the other there, but it's not really directed at any one person. It is directed at the sort of, nebulous malaise and, inability of one man to protect himself and his family. It is, I think, probably the only real reflection of, the idea of the land and the world that he loves, that sort of isolated, charmed New England life, as he puts it, that small town, small, community, living outside of the, cut off from the rest of the world. It's one of the few stories where I think he really delves into what is wrong with that lifestyle, or what could possibly go wrong with being so isolated, and how isolation in and of itself can cause more harm than good. Now, we get a far more insider look in the movie than we do in the short story. The short story is essentially told twice removed. It's told through the eyes of the narrator, who is the land surveyor, and then it is based on an interview with a friend of theirs. In the movie, we have a much more intimate view. Elliot Knight, who plays Ward. Ward is the hydrologist who comes, and even Ward doesn't have as much of an insider view until maybe closer to the end of the movie, as we really see through the daughter, Madeline Arthur, who plays Lavinia. She is really the one that is seeing how this is unfolding. Okay, and I think what they do with this movie is very quintessentially cosmic horror. I think that's the reason it is so popular. It is an adaptation of specifically The Color Out of Space, but there are little nods to other cosmic horror stories. Like, for example, we see a scene where Ward is out in his tent. He's camping out in the woods. And the scene sort of revolves around nature as a personified monster. I use personified because I'm not really sure. Monsterified. And we've talked about that in past issues of Cosmic Horror, of Cosmic Shenanigans, where we talk about, an element of cosmic horror is the indifference of nature as almost, an entity, that the surroundings, that the backdrop or the atmosphere, the setting is as much a character in these cases as the characters themselves. And what we see here is Ward reading The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. And Blackwood's claim to fame in a cosmic horror sense is this monstrification of nature, this indifferent force which is greater than us. And that is a subtle but running theme through a lot of cosmic horror that I've discovered in doing this show, actually, that it's a lot more present. It's present in Lovecraft's work, but it's present in a lot of Lovecraft's contemporaries even more so. The movie updates and simplifies timelines. Because again, as I mentioned, a lot of Lovecraft's work was a story inside a story inside a story, whether it's through letters or interviews or whatever. This kind of modernizes it. We have Nate, who has basically banked his fortune on a llama farm. An alpaca farm. And, he and his wife are, making a go of this. She is, and they're not 100% clear on this, but it's an interesting aspect. Teresa has recently undergone surgery for breast cancer. We understand that it's probably a mastectomy because it has seriously impacted her, sense of self-confidence and her relationship with her husband in an intimate way. The movie starts off with Lavinia, who is very heavily into witchcraft and the occult, performing a ritual to heal her mother. So we get the sense of the occult as, it's a nice little subtle touch that her interest in the occult is one of those cosmic horror, tropes, I guess, where she's pursuing arcane or occult knowledge. And because she is, partially because she is a teenage girl and partially because it is the nature of cosmic horror, she is pursuing knowledge which should be forbidden to her because she's not quite ready to handle it yet. At one point, Ward meets her out in the woods and asks if she's if it's a Wiccan or, I think an even older kind of magic. I forget the word he uses. I apologize. If it's an older system of magic, and he opts to say that he thinks it's an older system of magic, and she says he's wrong. The issue is that, the ritual she is doing is Wiccan, more or less, but her source material and the people that she's calling on actually are from an older system of magic. We don't come to find until a very tiny little, almost a cutaway scene that a lot of the sources of her ritual magic are coming from the Necronomicon. And the kind of cool thing is that they use the Simon version of the Necronomicon, which is the kind that you can find on Amazon now. So it's kind of a cute little nod to the idea that because if you've ever read or, seen the Simon version of the Necronomicon, it's written very deadpan, very serious as an abridged version of the Necronomicon. So what you're getting, and it's in both real systems of magic and in Lovecraft systems, a lot can go wrong if you are not given all of the information to perform a ritual correctly, either to summon something or to dispel it. And one of the beautiful things about this movie is the subtlety with which it uses elements of nature, elements of the occult, and elements of Lovecraft's work without hitting you over the head with it, but in this beautifully subtle blend of all of these things working together to form a really scary horror movie. We have essentially, we're going to come back to the idea of nature, but first I want to look at the idea of colors. Because the movie is a color out of space, colors play a big role in the movie, but not in the way that you'd think. There are certain movies where you come to find psychologically that they are using colors as an almost Pavlovian way of getting you to respond a certain way. Like you see the color red, every time you see the color red, it means it's a problem. Or, you'll see the color green or blue and it means something in the movie over and over and over again. That's kind of the case here, but we're presented with an interesting problem in adapting the color out of space. Throughout the story, it is described as a color nobody's ever seen before, so nobody can ever describe it. How do you apply that to a visual medium? What the filmmakers do here, what Stanley does, is essentially it's a purplish, pinkish, bluish color. So it is a consistency, but what it is it's a consistency of a multicolored color. So rather, and Nicolas Cage does say at some point, well, it's a color, I don't know how to describe it. I don't think I've ever seen a color like that before. But it's because it's really an ever-changing color. It's a multiple color. It's a color that does different things at different times and manifests itself as much light as it is color. And it's kind of, I think, the only way you could adapt that particular principle to something like a color out of space, a color that nobody's ever seen before. And we get it in little ways. We get the reinforcement of the pervasiveness of this color in cool little subtle ways. There's a poster of a nebula in Benny's room because he's big into space stuff. So he's got a lot of posters of the surface of the moon, the surfaces of other planets. And he's got a picture of a nebula, and the colors in the nebula, the color out of space, essentially, is this purplish, bluish, pinkish color. We see a news truck. The logo on the news truck is done in shades of blue and pink and purple. We see the curtains in the house. The curtains in Nathan's house are not, and that's the interesting thing, is that a lot of the movie is beautifully filmed, but it's filmed with no particularly special attention to color other than the color out of space. Like, as I said, it's a lovely location where they live. It's a beautiful place. But the house has sort of muted, neutral colors. Until things start to change, you don't realize how much in the house is this purplish, pinkish, bluish color. The curtains are, there's a picture on one of their walls, a painting, I think, that is that color. When they get in the car, their dashboard lights are those colors. And little things like, little things like the ice cubes that Nathan continually puts in his drink. He develops a sort of drinking habit. I don't want to say quite a problem, because it's more of a habit. His problems are elsewhere. But it's in the ice cubes. It's in the glinting of light off the ice cubes, that color. It's in the water when Lavinia is washing dishes. It's that glint of those different colors. It's in people's eyes. When light reflects in their eyes for just a moment, you see the pink and purple and blue color, which becomes more and more prominent as the color out of space gains more and more and more of a foothold in this area. And it's under their skin. I don't know how they do this special effect, but you can see the colors under their skin as this entity, this color, takes over. One of the, I think, the fascinating aspects that they do, and Lovecraft doesn't often do this, but I've noticed that a lot of cosmic horror, like Annihilation, and some other more modern cosmic horror, shows, they do this in interesting juxtaposition of beauty and death, that the alien entity, is actually beautiful. I think this is an extension of the idea of something being so foreign and so alien to us that it may not always even look like a threat. I mean, generally, instinctively, as animals, we tend to shy away from things that smell bad or look bad or sound bad because they may represent some, disease or death or danger to us. They are reflective of death. In this movie, sometimes the more beautiful something is, the more horrific it is on the inside, or the more tragic and terrifying it is to see that ugliness on the inside start to cause a grotesque malignancy on the outside. We do see a bit of madness. I don't know that any cosmic horror would be complete without somebody going a little insane. And in this case, it is also very subtly done. We see the color out of space affects different people differently. There is an element of hallucination, and I use that word loosely because I'm not sure that they're actually hallucinating these things, or if the color is actually creating these things for them. In cosmic horror, and in a lot of psychological horror, it doesn't really much matter either way what the truth of that is, because the effect is the same. They see these things that they can't explain and that seem to be somewhat fleeting and ephemeral, and it has a negative impact on them. But the idea of actual madness, and I apply this to Nathan because the madness in this case, the word mad, like people say, oh, I'm mad, and they mean that they're angry. But the word madness actually refers to insanity. I like that word in application to Nicolas Cage's character, Nathan, because it's both. His insanity comes across as hostility and anger, and it's these weird bouts that come out of nowhere, where he almost sounds like Jack Nicholson, actually. He sounds like a raving Jack Nicholson, and then it snaps off. And there's an inherent violence and hatred and ugliness every time, and these bouts increase and increase and increase. And Nathan is the only one affected in this way. We could theorize for a number of different reasons why this might be. In the short story, Nahum comes across as a very laid back, low key kind of guy, a guy that kind of goes with the flow, a guy that doesn't want to upset the apple cart in any way, a guy that is more perplexed and dismayed than angry at his situation. He's a man that is sort of prone to accepting things and giving up, because there's a certain idea of acceptance, both with that generation and I think with that the general character of people of that area, where there's this just stoic acceptance of life the way it is. And I think for the friend in the original short story, that is a source of frustration, because it seems like Nahum is just accepting the deterioration of his family. And that rather than fight it, they just withdraw more and more and more and more. In the movie, it's actually his anger that causes them to withdraw. He does try to fight it. They all do. And they keep meeting with the inevitability of it. And I think that is one of the true horrors of this particular story, is the inevitable decline of something you can't stop. To me, this short story always represented people's fear of illness. You know, with the coronavirus now, you see, and with a lot of epidemics and pandemics in the past, it was this terrifying fear of abandonment and isolation because the sick people might be contagious. That is a major issue in the short story itself. It doesn't seem to come up quite as often in the movie. It's almost that they take it in a slightly different direction. In that, the part of the problem is that with modern society, we do dismiss, I think in the past when perhaps medicine wasn't as good as it is now, we did take far more precautions. We were far more prone to abandoning the sick because it was a self-preservation thing. And there is an element, I think, of modern horrors or modern society's horror about illnesses that, despite precautions that could be taken, we act recklessly and irregularly. In some ways, we are absolutely prone to going to extremes of avoiding. I mean, like, to give it another example of the coronavirus, people who won't drink Corona beer because of the coronavirus. Like stupid, ways that people, that people go to lengths to avoid this. And yet engage in other behaviors which are just dangerous. And that kind of comes up in this movie that, there is no sense of being afraid that touch or proximity is influencing them. And is causing this color to be able to jump from one to the other. But they have no problem, and this was true in the story too, they have no problem drinking the water, which is, they're basically told is a contamination. It is a source of this contamination. One of the people I want to mention, and I'm not sure I mentioned this originally when I listed the people who star in this movie. Tommy Chong is in this movie. Now, I'm not sure I've ever seen Tommy Chong in anything that wasn't drug related. I think of him as like the ultimate pothead, the ultimate ex-hippie. He is very good in this and serves a very important role. And I'm hesitant to, well, you know what? I'm just going to say it. I've never been afraid of spoilers on the show before, so I'm just going to go for it. The one issue that I had with Color Out of Space, the one thing that I think from a technical standpoint does not work is when Nahum is dying, when he has clearly been affected, his mind has been affected by this color. He hallucinates that his wife and children are still there and still okay. He goes into this, he can barely talk because he's lost most of his humanity to this disease, this graying, wasting disease that the color causes. And he goes into this like very, very, very lengthy monologue about what happened to his family in that one last moment of clarity about what happened to him and his family, how it affects people, how the color kills people. It would not be possible for him to sustain vocal patterns and talk and think this long in the condition that he's in. It was the only issue I had with the story. In this story, Tommy Chong is a squatter who lives on their land, on Nathan's land. And they let him live there. They don't say why, but they have neat little scenes where Ward goes and visits him and tries to talk to him about the water. And, he's got these doll parts that he's made into these sigils, these ritual sigils to ward things off. He introduces a lot of little subtle information like he makes them a cup of coffee, but he mentions that there's something sort of brackish about the water. It always kind of has been that way. What he represents, I think, is the idea that long before the Color Out of Space came, there was a problem with this place. And in a lot of subtle ways, the filmmakers suggest that there's always been something wrong. That maybe the color has been there longer than they think. Or that the precursors of the color, that the situation for the color to have been able to take hold in this area has always been there. And, that there's always been a predisposition to death and destruction in this area, that death is inevitable and always was, even before the color got there. And Tommy Chong is kind of, I think, the element that brings that home, because he has been warding off something in these witch-haunted woods, as they put it, for years. He's isolated. He's a hermit. He is, of course, because he's Tommy Chong, he is an ex-hippie. And he dresses strangely. He probably does grow pot in some part of the, backyard there and is smoking it up. There's a point where he says, that the aliens under the floor are talking to him. And both in the movie and in the short story, there is an element, and you could say it's madness or not, or it could actually be happening, that the color does try to communicate with people, that it whispers to them, that it tells them horrible things. And in the story, this is what drove Nahum's wife and one of his sons insane. It is something that affects the little one in the movie, that he can hear the creatures, which the color is alternately referred to as it and they. But the man in the well, as the little kid puts it, Jack puts it, is, he can hear the man in the well talking to him, whispering to him. Which brings us basically to the alien. And I love to focus on the alien. In cosmic horror, we have, in Lovecraft's cosmic horror, Lovecraft made it a point to emphasize the alienness, the unknowableness of the motivations and thoughts and feelings of the alien entity, of the other. That part of the fear was that they don't think like us, they don't act like us, they don't have the same customs, the same spiritual outlook, the same value for life that we do. And this, of course, we've come to find over years and years, was this fear of other cultures who were not that basically white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, New England view of life. Instead of being interested and fascinated by other viewpoints of the world, he was terrified of them because they were not like his. And that comes through in these alien entities, that they are so different to our way of thinking that we could never possibly understand them. Now, I think this is also a reflection of the idea that, we don't understand the motivations of nature because sometimes there are none. Nature is a force that is largely indifferent and largely ignorant of us unless we keep pushing, our faces in its way. And that's when it reacts to us. What I think is interesting about modern cosmic horror is the idea that a lot of times, creators try to include some thought or feeling about, or motivation for the alien entity, or the interdimensional entity, but still have it be something that we can't really conceive of in our way of thinking. That they have a motivation, but that they don't understand us any more than we understand it, and that there's a horror in that disconnect. That's, I guess, what it really comes down to. Not so much that we are unable to know what they're thinking, but that we're unable to reconcile our thinking with their thinking. And we only get a little glimpse of that. That again, the horror of this, the alien, the entity itself, is, I guess, embodied by nature. And it's beautiful. We see these gorgeous but wrong flowers growing. And they do this neat thing throughout the movie where the flowers will ebb and recede or swell toward one of the characters. But it's happening in the background. And unless you're really looking at it, you won't notice it. The flowers are moving toward the character. They're growing toward the character. And sometimes they remove themselves from one spot and end up in another spot. There are these gorgeous purple vines growing up around trees, but it's of a purple that's just dark enough to suggest something dying or something strangling those trees. There's an incident where Jack sees, the color pulsing at the bottom of the well, and it cracks open almost like an egg. And what flies up and out of the well is this beautiful cross between a grasshopper and a butterfly that's purple and pink and blue. It's the same color as the color out of space. But when you look at it up close, there's no feature of that face that's even identifiable as a bug of our world, as an insect of our world. It is when the one flash close up that they have of this insect, it's got multiple eyes, and there's something sentient about the eyes. There's something threatening about the little tubes that come out of, like, I guess it's proboscis. I don't really want to know too much about the anatomy of insects, but this entity is part of it. And we get the sense that the color itself is both a single entity and a multiple entity, which is why it keeps, there is that back and forth of referring to it as an it and a they. It is both an it and a they, which is difficult for us to conceive of, but it is both the color itself and all the things that the color touches, all of the flora, all of the fauna that is developing as a result of this color's influence. And what we get, and I think this is really cool, is, that its communication attempts, whatever it's trying to tell people, we are never made aware of that. All we know is that every time it tries to communicate with someone, that person goes mad. Or the communications, because it even tries to talk to them on the phone. which I know sounds silly, but in the movie, it is so well done that you roll with it. It tries to call them on the phone, and its voice is terrifying. Its voice is garbled, and it interrupts the cell phone reception, the Wi-Fi. It interrupts the electrical systems of the house, but it is trying to communicate with them. The only word we can recognize is its attempt to say Lavinia's name. Whatever else it is trying to tell them, we are not privy to that, and maybe that's a good thing. Okay. But what they do, suggest, and again, it's one line in the movie that seems to sum up the alien's motivation. It is trying to remake the world into something it knows. And there's something sort of beautiful and horrifying about this idea that what this entity does is, it is, whether intentionally or not, on a foreign world that is unfamiliar and maybe terrifying to the entity, but it has the ability to remake things into something comforting and familiar. The horror of that is that it's comforting and familiar. The thing that gives it comfort and familiarity destroys us from the inside out. We cannot reconcile our lives with the invasion of this thing that for its own self-preservation is doing what it's got to do. And then finally, I think that, there's a beautiful intro, which is right out of the short story. And there's also a beautiful extra, I think they call it, where the ending lines, where you see Ward, years later talking about what this idea that once this color has gone, like in the story, when it comes, shooting up out of the well and causes this entire area to be gray and brittle, this blasted heath. They call it in the short story, that the whole reason the hydrologist was there in the first place was because the mayor's plans were to submerge this entire area underwater. And of course, the inherent horror of that is that of all the things, even after they stopped eating the meat that was feeding on this flora, and they stopped eating the farm foods that were grown, these plants, these vegetables, and fruits that were growing in their orchards and their farm. Even after they stopped taking in, basically all of the salt of the earth that you feed on and live on and breathe on, and where it becomes a part of you, they still kept drinking the water. And that was their undoing, was that the water from the well was, basically just infused with this color. And that's how it got to them. And now that entire area is underwater. And is there any of it left? Is there any of that contamination left? Did all of the color leave? Because in the short story, it suggested that it didn't. Because again, it is both an it and a we. And even if most of we left, even if most of they left, is still some part of it there. The last few lines of the movie sum up the cosmic horror magnitude, that there are things we can't possibly understand, and they're opening up terrifying vistas to us that numb us and dull our senses. In, I think, modern cosmic horror, it's not the horrificness of not knowing. In modern society, and this has been often an element of horror about modern times, is that we are numb to it, that we are dulled or jaded, and that it's still drinking the water because we just don't care or just don't put enough thought into it, that is ultimately going to undo all of us. This movie is definitely worth seeing. It's beautifully filmed. It deserves, in my opinion, all of the accolades that it has received. It is, I think, one of the best adaptations of a Lovecraft story, because it is not heavy-handed in let me put in all the in-jokes for Lovecraft fans. Let me work in every little, reference to Lovecraft's work. The way they do it is subtle and, very reverent, I think, of the source material, but in a way that is far more inclusive and far more updated for modern cosmic horror. It's definitely a movie worth seeing. So that's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode of Cosmic Shenanigans, you may enjoy past and future episodes, which you can find in the same place you find any place that you listen to podcasts. Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Radio, I think it's called now. Basically any place where you're getting podcasts, you can find me on Cosmic Shenanigans here. You can also find other podcasts that are near and dear to my heart. I co-host The Horror Show with Brian Keene, which is also in all of these places. You can support writer and engineer extraordinaire Matt Wilderson. Grindcast is his podcast, which is available in all the same places. We will have in the near future some updates regarding the network on which these podcasts are going to appear. So stay tuned for that. I will have a more detailed and specific message for you next time about that. In the meantime, check us out and enjoy your own cosmic shenanigans in your own life every day, past, present, and future. It's all good. And I will see you next week. Bye.